Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2022. And specifically, I'd like to focus on this wonderful set release, which was made earlier this year, and this is the Infernal Affairs trilogy, and this set is given comprehensively the set spine number of 1159. I'd like to focus today, if I may, on a specific film that can be found in such set, and it's a film which is described as being from the year 2003. And this is a work which is again from the filmmakers Andrew Lau, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak. And the name of the work is Infernal Affairs 3. This is, of course, the work from the year 2003, and it is from the filmmakers, the great filmmakers, Andrew Lau Wai-keung and Alan Mak. And it is the screenplay by Alan Mak and Felix Chung Man-keung. And it has, what a cast this is. Andy Lau, Takwa, and Tony Leung Chiu Wai, Leon Lai, Edison Chen Kun Hei, Sean Yu, Man Lok, Eric Tsang, Chi Wai, Chapman To Manchak, Anthony Wong Chao Sang, and others. This is the work, this is the great epic work, the sweeping work, so psychologically complex, a very complex film also in the context of this Infernal Affairs trilogy. And I'm speaking, of course, of this work, which is Infernal Affairs 3. Infernal Affairs 3 is such a very clever film in how it handles time and chronology and going back and forth and trying to deal with characters that perhaps in watching, say, the first film, or indeed in watching the first film and the second film, one can think, how are they going to do that? When you walk into this film, you know, I'd seen the first film and I know what happens by the first film's end. So I wonder, okay, now that I have that information, how are they going to bring these characters back? Or how are they going to explain this after what we saw happen to that character in, say, the first film or the second film? And these and other questions, I think, emerge. They did for me when I first saw this film, again, many years back. Again, how would they do this? How would they try to tie up these ends that we could say existed when we watched the conclusions of Infernal Affairs and Infernal Affairs 2, respectively? So what gives, right? And indeed, I think that is part of the charm of this film, Infernal Affairs 3. It is how it operates in this universe, given or perhaps despite a lot of the things and events and character developments and arcs and the comings and goings, if you will, of various plot points and character developments of Infernal Affairs and Infernal Affairs 2. And that is part of the clever charm of Infernal Affairs 3, and indeed how it figures in characters that perhaps we thought would have, say, died in earlier films, and they emerge through one form or another in Infernal Affairs 3 in a very clever way. And those clever ways have to do, I think, with, first of all, how this film, Infernal Affairs 3, deals with time. It handles events in a way that could be said to give this film prequel status vis-a-vis Infernal Affairs, because part of the story does involve events that are leading up or immediately leading up to those events that we saw in Infernal Affairs, the first film. So part of this, or component of it, of Infernal Affairs 3 serves as a prequel, a direct or immediate prequel. Other parts of Infernal Affairs 3 serve as a sequel, a subsequent or an immediate sequel, so describing events that we understand occur a little bit after the end of Infernal Affairs. Therefore, this film, Infernal Affairs 3, is a prequel and a sequel at the same time, and it juggles those points, I think, very, very well, very effectively. And what it does too, it carries on the intrigue of the sort of the mole status, or the person hidden within a certain block of society. Here we're focusing in on the police and police enforcement, and of course this parallel or mirror imaging between the police and the crime or criminal organization or syndicate. This is also derived very well and very close knit to what we saw, how these themes were treated in Infernal Affairs and Infernal Affairs 2 respectively. So there is a sense of continuity and organic, say, unity with the other two films, while in many ways expanding the story, because we do get specific plot developments that could be said to have really serious ramifications for the events that we saw leading up to the end of, say, Infernal Affairs specifically. And so we do get a type of conclusion, or one can say as a type of conclusion to those events that we saw in Infernal Affairs. And I think that's fitting. And this is, of course, the Infernal Affairs trilogy. And so there is a sense of the trilogy concluding in a particular manner. However, and again, I'm trying to be as vague as possible here, because I don't want to spoil the experience for those who have yet to see Infernal Affairs 3. However, I should, point out that there is a way in which this film does things in a very clever mode, in a very clever fashion. And it does, that cleverness, I think, is done not in a way that is maybe too clever by half, as the expression goes, but rather it is done in a way that still, I would suggest, maintains an inherent integrity and quality of organic connectivity with the first two films, in particular with the first film. Now, what do I mean by this? There is a way in which characters emerge or reappear that perhaps, given the circumstances of what happened to them in previous films, we would think that it would have been impossible to have these characters come back again. But they do. And they do in a way that is, I think, very reflective of how this film, and indeed these films overall, and how in particular Infernal Affairs 3 is one that is, again, described, or one it can be described as a film that is about friendships and loyalties and betrayals. It's also about hidden agendas, people who are covering their tracks, people who say that they are one thing, but in fact are completely different from what their outer surface indicates, but how that has a psychological toll on those particular people. And that might lead to some kind of moral-based, or perhaps even religious or philosophical-based reckoning by the film's conclusion. It may or may not. That's part of the suspense or tension of the film that carries us forward, the trajectory that carries us, the viewers, forward as we watch Infernal Affairs 3. So there are those aspects, of course, to it. But the way in which, too, that this film, in a sense, brings back characters, I think is so consistent with how we can view this film, or regard this film and the other films in the series, as psychological dramas. If one can use the phrase psychological drama in the context of these films, I think it's so apropos when talking about Infernal Affairs 3. There is a way in which characters are configured into this film, and images and memories are configured into this film, that is it is a tour de force of, say, filmmaking and storytelling, but it's also so consistent with how we are exploring the ways in which characters are have had their psychological states impacted so much by the events of this film, as well as the events of Infernal Affairs 2, and also the events of Infernal Affairs. And we see the cause and effect, the effect, the mental effect, the emotional and mental effect, and how this emotional and mental effect in cinematic terms and in storytelling terms provides the basis by which the storytellers can bring characters back, in a manner of speaking. Let me just put it that way. So in that way, it is a really intriguing premise, both in terms of a cinematic feat, a threequel, this third film in a trilogy. How are they going to pull it off in a way that feels similar and yet stands on its own? And I think one thing can be said about this film, Infernal Affairs 3. In this way, it does feel very consistent with the previous films. We do get characters that we have met before, but it is done in a way that twists it. It's done in a way that really gets into the hearts and minds and souls of certain characters. And in this way, in this twisting of the knife, in this twisting of the cinematic knife, we get some really fascinating outcomes indeed. And that is how I think those outcomes form the foundation of the storytelling going forward in Infernal Affairs 3, while at the same time really trying to provide some kind of conclusion to the arc, to the story, to this epic that started with Infernal Affairs, that continued on in the follow-up with Infernal Affairs 2, and now we get, in many ways, the epic conclusion in Infernal Affairs 3. So it's so many things at once. Now, we mentioned, too, about, in the earlier films discussions, respectively, how those films too are they have this social political context in the context of 1997, leading up to 1997 and post 1997, and that's certainly true here for Infernal Affairs 3. Also, what's true is that there is a sense in those films of religious or philosophical, suffering or portrayals of suffering and causing harm, cause and effect, and moral reckoning. Those, I think, were very much part of the tableau and tapestry of Infernal Affairs and Infernal Affairs 2. It is certainly the case in Infernal Affairs 3, and that is one of the great genius aspects of Infernal Affairs 3, which is it takes this aspect, in fact, one can say it intensifies it, and it brings things into focus in a way that I think really rounds out and brings to a whole this Infernal Affairs trilogy concept. The existence of Infernal Affairs 3 and how it handles this notion of suffering and moral reckoning, I think, brings things full circle. And it's that bringing into full circle, in a very clever way, bringing it into full circle that makes this film so important and so impactful in the context of the Infernal Affairs universe, in a manner of speaking. So in that way, this is such a dynamic and a very important work. Now, if I were to try to explain what are my favorite films in the Infernal Affairs trilogy series, I don't know if I would say Infernal Affairs 3. I mean, I acknowledge that perhaps for me personally, I don't see it. I enjoy Infernal Affairs very much. I think Infernal Affairs is for me the high point of the trilogy if I had to rank them. And then I enjoy Infernal Affairs 2 second, and then I enjoy Infernal Affairs 3 third in that ranking, if I had to rank them. But that is not in any way for me to suggest that I dislike the film Infernal Affairs 3. I think what it does as a third film in the trilogy, it does very well. It's very clever. Perhaps to some, it might seem a little bit too much, maybe going in a particular direction. Maybe for some, it might be seen as going a little bit beyond what we had seen in the first film, Infernal Affairs. And if you feel that way after seeing Infernal Affairs 3, if you feel it to be, quote unquote, the weak link in the trilogy, that's very fair, that's very valid, that's very legitimate. But my point that I wanted to bring in the context of such a conversation or a similar conversation is, even if one feels that way, I think one can still hold an interpretation or reading of Infernal Affairs 3 to see that it does have an organic center, or it does have an organically honed continuity with the first film and second film by virtue of its setup as a bona fide psychological drama, by how it sets up characters and how it presents information. It is therefore inherently linked to Infernal Affairs and Infernal Affairs 2. And I go back to the comments made by the filmmakers in some of the supplements for Infernal Affairs, the first disc, where they describe it. Of course, they got some pressure to try to add some action scenes to the first film, Infernal Affairs. But in fact, they regarded it, Andrew Lau, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak regarded the film as a type of psychological drama. and it has very contemplative scenes of characters, say, thinking and regarding and worrying and suffering and interacting with others, the stuff of drama, in a manner of speaking. And you add on to that the complexity of the psychological and emotional complexities of the situations that they are in, lying to others, lying to oneself, betraying others, betraying oneself, etc., etc. And so in that context, if one can look at Infernal Affairs through that reading, Infernal Affairs 2 through that reading, then watching Infernal Affairs 3, I think, makes so much sense. How Infernal Affairs 3 is organized makes so much sense. Again, it might not be the strongest film in the trilogy for people. If you feel that way, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But even so, it does maintain a sense of, I think, thematic integrity with the first two films, a fidelity with the first two films that I think is so very soulful, very very thoughtful, and very rich indeed. And that is not to say that Infernal Affairs 3 is not engaging or not entertaining. On the contrary, there are moments that are very thrilling, very high tension, dramatic, suspenseful. There are moments of real intense, brutal scenes of, say, action and violence as well that are very much part of the equation for this and other films. So this is overall a wonderful film and a very important part of this trilogy, and it's a very important and very wonderful and engaging film on its own. And of course, I'm speaking of this film, which is Infernal Affairs 3. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Infernal Affairs 3, as part of this overall set. It is on the third disc of this 3-disc Blu-ray set. Again, the set is the Infernal Affairs trilogy. And a word about the restorations can be found, as I've read in the previous video discussions on the other films. It can be found on page 30 of the great booklet that's part of the set overall. But once again, let me read from that, which is Infernal Affairs 2, and Infernal Affairs 3 are presented in their original aspect ratio of 2.35 to 1. These 4K digital restorations were undertaken by Media Asia from the 35 millimeter original camera negative at l'Immagine Ritrovata's facilities in Bologna, Italy, and Hong Kong. The original 5.1 surround soundtracks were remastered from the digital audio master files. So my comments about my feelings of the presentation, this digital restoration presentation for Infernal Affairs 3, will be pretty much identical to my comments that I made for Infernal Affairs and Infernal Affairs 2. Namely, that my experience with Infernal Affairs 3 is not at all through the movie theater experience, unfortunately. I've only watched this film prior to this release. I've watched this film on home media releases, discs or DVDs and the like. For example, this Tartan Asia Extreme DVD set, which I have shown in previous videos and I'll show again here. It does have a disc for Infernal Affairs 3, so I do have that experience. My experience, though, I admit, is limited, so I don't have the benefit of being able to compare, say, the movie theater experience of watching the print of Infernal Affairs 3 on the screen versus watching this new Criterion release or this new this 4K restoration release. So that being said, again, like my previous experiences with the Infernal Affairs films, as I've mentioned before, I have this way of looking at, or my understanding of Infernal Affairs, including Infernal Affairs 3, is looking at it through this type of high-tech video sheen that I think informs my reading of the film Infernal Affairs 3 as a type of a video or visual aesthetic that leads to my reading of the film as a type of neo-noir. And I find that aspect still inherent in this restoration for 3 as well as 1 and 2. And I find that to be, for me, not at all distracting. On the contrary, I think it's very consistent with how I can read the film. And I felt that way about Infernal Affairs, and I feel that way about Infernal Affairs 2, and I certainly feel that way about Infernal Affairs 3. So in my eyes, I am not at all disappointed. If one feels that it probably, maybe the restoration isn't what it could have been potentially. If one feels that way, I totally understand that criticism one can have. But again, from my admittedly limited vantage point, I do have a sense that, for me, it is a very high quality restoration or presentation that still has a sense of fidelity to what my sense of the film Infernal Affairs 3 was based on my personal experience with the film growing up. And so we also have a supplement section, which is accompanying this third disc of Infernal Affairs 3. I should point out from the outset that, unfortunately, unlike the supplements that we'd seen for Infernal Affairs or Infernal Affairs 2, there is no commentary track for Infernal Affairs 3. I would have liked to have seen, I didn't mention this before, but maybe in the context of Infernal Affairs 3, because of the absence of any commentary track, it would have been great, for instance, to have seen or to have had a new commentary track for Infernal Affairs 3. That would have been really cool. And then by the same token, it would have been cool to have a new commentary track for Infernal Affairs and then a new one for Infernal Affairs 2, excuse me. That would have been really cool indeed. Because again, there's so much thematic complexity in these films, and it's definitely the case for Infernal Affairs 3 that it would have benefited so much, I think, from, or there would have been an additional benefit, I think, so much from having someone on a commentary track guide us in terms of how we could read this particular turn of a character or the scene as we read it versus how a similar scene might have played out in a previous film, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the context, the social political context. That could have been so great, but in any event, we have the film, and we have, it doesn't have a commentary track, unfortunately, but it does have a number of other supplements. Again, nothing newly produced by Criterion for 2022's Infernal Affairs 3 release, unfortunately. But what we do get is really very informative and very helpful. From previous, say, years or previous releases. So, for example, we do get a section which is interviews. This is described as being from 2004. And so we have, for example, Felix Chang and Alan Mak talking about experiences and talking about Andrew Lau and the Chinese film market and the mainland China film market and the Hong Kong film market and also other interviews with other performers and other actors like Chapman To and Kelly Chan and their roles. For instance, Kelly Chan, I think, is Kelly Chan Wai Lam. She brings up some comments which were mentioned in previous films, commentary tracks, and supplements. For example, the way in which female characters in the world of Infernal Affairs, their significance, and in terms of, say, the number of female characters versus the number of male characters, one can say that there are so many more male characters in terms of quantity, and then there are female characters, but the female characters have so much significance and weight and a character drive to them. There, again, this idea of cause and effect. The cause and effect relationship, the causal relationship, has such a profound effect on many characters, and her character here, Kelly Chan's character, is in many ways such a key character in previous film and of course in this film, both in terms of plot and in terms of how characters develop in a really critical way. And so this comment, or these comments by her, remind us too of this dynamic in the world of Infernal Affairs in a very interesting way. Also, we spoke too about how this film or these films have this idea of identity crisis or identity crises. And here in Infernal Affairs 3, one can say that this film also deals with this maybe in the sense of schizophrenia, and also how one identifies oneself in the context also of morality and guilt vis-a-vis a specific character development in Infernal Affairs 3. So this is also very important as well as some of the dealings of all the machinations and all the plot dynamics, everything, all the intricacies from, say, the prequel stuff and the sequel stuff and how it intertwines with Infernal Affairs 2, Infernal Affairs, etc. So this is all in all another great series of, say, interviews or excerpts, again, described as being from 2004, approximately 16 minutes overall. And then continuing on with the supplements, we have another making of featurette. This is approximately 12 minutes. And here we have more discussions, some new characters that we meet, or characters that maybe we haven't met before in other films that we're meeting for the first time. There's a sense of mystery and enigma about some of these new characters. And so there's a little bit of discussion there. Also, these idea of separate storylines that are linked together. It's not just true, that discussion is true not just for a description of Infernal Affairs 3, of course, but also how we can regard the entirety of the Infernal Affairs trilogy writ large. So the separate storylines that may or may not have a direct connection and meaning with each other. That is, I think, one of the most profound and really fascinating and indeed entertaining aspects of watching Infernal Affairs 3 and the Infernal Affairs trilogy overall, is how we can, quote unquote, connect the dots. It's really fascinating stuff. And also the notion of heaven and hell, suffering and moral reckoning, type of maybe divine justice in a manner of speaking. And this type of heaven and hell structure is so important when one is regarding and reading, I would suggest, this film, the Infernal Affairs trilogy films overall, and specifically Infernal Affairs 3. So for these and other reasons, it's great to have this, or it's great to see this again, this making of a featurette. So it's approximately 12 minutes. And then the supplements are rounded out by a trailer. So here we have the supplements features for the third disc for Infernal Affairs 3. Granted, I admit it does seem a little bit, relatively speaking, in terms of quantity, light. Again, I would have loved to have seen more, say, Criterion produced new supplements, new takes. Again, much like the discussion that we had for Infernal Affairs, it would have been great to have had a sit-down 2022 conversation between the filmmakers specifically about Infernal Affairs 3, or at least maybe to the same degree or similar degree of detail that we had seen them speak about in that first disc's supplement talking about Infernal Affairs. So that would have been really nice to have seen. But what we do get is still very informative and very helpful. And again, it is part of this overall package, which is this very key component of this trilogy, which is Infernal Affairs 3. So now let me round out our discussion today by focusing in on the booklet. But once again, we will have some more overall comments in a separate video talking about the set overall, including the comprehensive essay. So the booklet doesn't have any specific writing on each of the films separately, but what it does in terms of an essay, I should say, but what it does have for each of the films, including Infernal Affairs 3, it does have a little write-up about the film itself and some pictures associated with, starting on pages 12 and 13 of the booklet. You can see right here. And then on the following pages, it does have Infernal Affairs 3 specific information on the cast, crew, and production credits. So much like the other films, there is a little bit of space in this booklet devoted to this specific film, but then it follows with a comprehensive essay on all three films. And so let's focus, or let's save our comments on that until the separate video discussion. So for purposes of today, that rounds out my discussion of Infernal Affairs 3 as we find it in this Criterion Collection set from 2022. It is a marvelous film. It's very intriguing. It's very clever. It has a really neat and curious place as well when we regard the trilogy overall. And I think it has a nice thematic and dramatic functionality, and it has a wittiness, and it really is an example of the genius levels by which this story is constructed and reconstructed and reconstructed, because we can also say too that Infernal Affairs 3 is an entertaining reconstruction of what we have seen in films past, while still maintaining a sense of integrity with what we have also seen in the past, while also being its own thing. And that is a remarkable feat indeed. This is the film which is Infernal Affairs 3. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now. There will be one more video discussion on the set overall, so please stay tuned to this channel for more updates on that if you are interested. But until the next video, or until we see each other again, my dear friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies, including Infernal Affairs 3. So until the next one, my dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.